currently facing.
Thank you.
We are currently facing displacement from our homes and communities via gentrification, which, parallels with the settler colonial displacement that Palestinians are facing. So it's important to note that the sophisticated surveillance technology that's being used by the police in the United States is the same technology used by the IOF to oppress Palestinians. Many of you guys already know this, but the NYPD and Israeli police have exchange programs, and the weapons and the tactics that are being used and experimented on and battle tested on Palestinians are exported back to be used on us in our communities. But it's not just that we as Black people in the US and Palestinians share a common condition of oppression and a common enemy, but we also share a common history of resistance. We've always asserted our humanity by resisting the inhumane conditions imposed on us, and we always will. Many Black revolutionaries have identified with the Palestinian struggle and vice versa, from Malcolm X and the Black Panthers meeting with PLO leaders to Afro-Palestinians who fought on the front lines of liberation in Palestine. More recent example, during the Black Lives Matter movement, Palestinian activists were giving advice and tips to BLM protesters about how to manage the effects of tear gas and scum, which are chemical weapons that the IOF deploys against Palestinians. We can go on to the next slide. No, please. So I think this image is very powerful. It's a picture of the apartheid wall in Jerusalem, and it's showing George Floyd here, and then Iyad Halak, who was a 32-year-old autistic Palestinian man who was gunned down by the IOF at a checkpoint in the West Bank.
I'm struggling to get back into the slide view.
Oh, there it is.
I'm trying to get so that.
Okay, give us just a second, guys, sorry.
Sorry, y'all.
No, it's okay.
What was that?
Yeah, amongst yourselves.
Yeah. Maybe not.
Now talk amongst yourselves. Topic. This two-state solution, not a two-state solution.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it for that.
I already told them.
Yeah, but when I do that, so they can see.
Oh,
So,
can you miss someone else?
that's how it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
I can go back to it, so maybe.
And then you can control the slides.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, y'all, 1 sec. We're Zoom comrades.
Sorry for the tech difficulties, y'all. Nothing is going on.
No, they can hear everything, I just can't.
Today,
I can't do
they
both.
reinstated.
But a few people from like that, I think from a lot of our organizations, coalitions are there right now, so. we're happy.
Okay. I think you committed it.
Okay, I want to make sure you're ready.
Back to me.
It's your convenient, I'm not listening. Yes, yes. On the TV, it shows that on the right side. Like the window.
I don't have to, I'm not, yeah, I think you want that.
So this is what I did. Share the screen. Camilla says she can hear.
It's not the sound, I think it's not the sound, okay.
Because then from here I can shoot the slides.
I can, you want to host, yeah.
Yeah, they're connected to the.
Was it that people couldn't see the slides?
No, they could, but the problem is that I'm because I'm screen sharing, it's really the screen is showing.
Or, I mean, I have notes to read too, though, I don't know if I can read the notes. Does anyone else have a computer at this time?
I have it.
Computer?
Oh my gosh, yes.
I love you.
Actually, it's fine. I'll just use my phone for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just so you know it, you know it well.
Yes.
For now. Okay.
Thanks y'all for your patience.
Well, you didn't want to do it without this. There we go. This isn't-
And I see more people are coming in anyway, so
You have
perhaps
the
this is
same
a
number,
good
right?
time.
You're gonna see the same shit,
Can you minimize the picture on the side?
Yeah, the picture of my wife.
They can't see us, yes.
You have the same number.
Which is what?
You're gonna be accepting people in the room and stuff.
That's okay.
Well, that's why I stopped.
Oh. But I can still control the slide, right? Yeah. We'll just try it for now and see.
We're all family here too, so it's like we're gonna give each other grace.
Okay.
So it's fine.
All right.
No, we can.
Yeah, can you just minimize this?
I
think.
Do you have to do that?
No, so clears the post now.
Yeah, that's why I stopped because you're gonna be doing a bunch of stuff at the same time. You're making it-
I think it's on the.
Imani's on your.
So on over here, it's already, looks like it's already collapsed, but over there it doesn't show that.
Are you here? I think you have to try to that mouse.
On the mouse. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Amazing.
All right.
What?
All right. We'll try to keep it going. We'll see how this works and hopefully no more technical issues. Are people on Zoom able to hear us? Can you see the Zoom chat if people are?
Good. Can
They
hear
are. Awesome.
Thank you for your patience, for everyone's patience, we appreciate y'all.
Okay, so I think I was on this slide, I was talking about this image from the apartheid wall in Jerusalem, which is showing George Floyd. And then, Iyad Halak, who is a 32-year-old Palestinian man who was gunned down by the IOF at a checkpoint in the West Bank. And I think, kind of just, again, underscoring the, shared struggle that we face at the hands of state-sanctioned violence, between Black people, in the US and Palestinians. So tonight we'll focus on drawing parallels between Black and Palestinian solidarity through the lens of political prisoners. If you ask many folks in the US, and I think kind of maybe even the world at large, if America has political prisoners, people might say no, and not really understand the legacy of incarcerating, political dissidents in this country. Same within the Zionist entity, they will label these people as terrorists, criminals, disruptors. But to ground everyone in the same understanding, we define political prisoners as people who are incarcerated for acts of resistance to domestic and international oppression. So these are people who've challenged the power of the state through their political affiliations and activity. And if we want to get really deep, I would even argue that most, if not all, prisoners in the US and Palestine are political prisoners. I think this is especially obvious in Palestine because of the nature of the illegal occupation and the apartheid legal system, which literally incarcerates and criminalizes Palestinians for existing on their own land. And, it's also true in the United States, maybe not to the same degree as, maybe not to the same, in the classical sense of people being incarcerated for their political activity. But, the nature of mass incarceration came about as a response to the social movements of the 60s and 70s. And the massive, social upheaval that caused. So prisons were heavily and are still heavily relied on as tools of social control and literally as ways to cage resistance. So why care about political prisoners? For one, these are people who made the ultimate sacrifice and they put their lives and their bodies on the line for the fight for a better world. They are many times the most skilled and knowledgeable organizers in our movements. And the state hopes to fracture and destroy our movements through locking them away and isolating our freedom fighters so that we can't continue to build and sustain our movements. Especially within the current historical moment, I think it's important for us to focus on political prisoners because we're creating new, or the state is creating new political prisoners every single day. Over the past 10 to 15 years, even since 2020, I can think of like so many different examples. The Stop Cop City movement, there's protesters facing these trumped up RICO charges. Julian Assange was on trial just last week for exposing the war crimes of the United States. The Merrimack Three, which were Palestine action activists who are facing like 30 years in prison for protesting against Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest weapons contractor. And there's just like more and more examples to think of, but these cases reflect the larger historical trend of the US targeting radicals and political activists who challenge the repressive capitalist system. So tonight we want to focus on a few key Black and Palestinian political prisoners. There's so many that we can talk about. It would literally be a 10-hour conversation, but there's just a few kind of stories to highlight, just again to underscore the importance of the legacy of these people who fought for our freedoms. So before moving forward, I want to, dedicate this conversation to the political prisoners who've recently passed away while incarcerated or soon after being released, and just kind of pay homage to some of our martyrs. So Sekou Odinga, who's in the top, I guess, left on, if you're looking on Zoom. He was held in prison for 33 years for his involvement in the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army. He passed away last month. Ed Poindexter was incarcerated for 45 years and died at the hands of the state as a result of medical neglect. Kader Adnan, who's the picture there in the bottom right with his kids. He was a Palestinian activist and political prisoner who died last year after an 87-day hunger strike, protesting his illegal detention in the Zionist prisons. He never even went to trial. Dr. Mutulu Shakur, he's a freedom fighter with the Black Liberation Army. He started the Lincoln Detox program, offering drug treatment to Black and Brown people in the South Bronx, and was incarcerated for 60 years for his health justice activism, and soon after his release passed away, again, from medical neglect at the hands of the state while he was incarcerated. Rochelle McGee, he was the longest held political prisoner in the United States. He was incarcerated for 67 years. And then most recently, there in the bottom left, Muhammad Abu Snena, he's a 16-year-old child who was recently martyred in the Zionist prisons. And it's worth noting that 8 Palestinians have been killed in occupation prisons since October 7. And these are a few of the political prisoners who are still alive, still incarcerated, and serving time. We still have time to save them. We're going to speak a bit more about this later in the presentation about some of the campaigns to agitate for their release.
Josh is up for parole next month. If you have time, just send some emails. That'll be really great.
Yeah, Josh Williams, he's a protester that was incarcerated during the Ferguson uprisings and has been serving, I think, almost a decade in prison at this point. Some important figures to highlight. As I mentioned, there's so many people that we can talk about, but for one, I want to speak about Jalil Muttaqim. He was a member of the Black Panther Party and one of the longest held political prisoners in the US. He served 49 years. He was key and an instrumental figure in, pushing for the recognition of political prisoners in the United States. The petition that was sent to the UN in 1976 was, I think the first petition from prisoners that was presented to the United Nations to recognize the existence of political prisoners in the US and also recognize the inhumane conditions in US prisons. He was also a co-founder of the Jericho Movement, which is an organization working for the freedom of political prisoners. Sophia Bukhari, also a co-founder of the Jericho Movement, also involved in the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army. She was another key figure in the fight for release of political prisoners in the US. And on the Palestinian side, I think we'd be remiss to not talk about Fatima Bernarwi. She was an Afro-Palestinian freedom fighter and member of Fatah. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison for planning an armed operation against the Zionist entity. She ended up being released 10 years later in a prisoner exchange, but she was the first Palestinian woman political prisoner of the post-1976 era, or sorry, 1967 era. And again, just kind of showing that Black and Palestinian solidarity once again. And I love this picture of her sticking her tongue out. That was her mugshot when she was put into Zionist prison. So yeah, it's just a mood. So I'll hand it over to my comrade to continue the rest of the presentation and talk a little bit more about some of the Palestinian political prisoners.
Yes, so these slides and this content was curated by Yazen, who is also from Healthcare Workers for Palestine, and he mentored me in understanding and really fully understanding the significance of these Palestinian revolutionaries. So it's, we ended on our elder Fatima, who was also in the Fatah party, but we have Khalida Jarrad, who was, they're both so Fatah and Popular Front Liberation Palestine, PFLP, they're both parts of the PLO. And that was in the 60s and 70s. That was the major political party that was trying to centralize political control in Palestine. And so there's a reason we put these two women next to each other, because although our elder Fatima was in Fatah, we had Khalida Jarrad, who was active during the 80s and 90s. She was the director of the Amir Prisoner Support and Human Rights. And she was arrested for leading peace vigils, for doing things that build community. And so she's been arrested since '86. And while in prison, she published Fashioning Hope Out of Despair, How to Resist Inside Israeli Prisons. And she was really one of the first people and women, prisoner activists, that documented, synthesized knowledge and recorded it to present to the world about how awful women, specifically also men, are treated in Israeli and Zionist prisons. And these parallels are almost identical to American prisons. So she has been arrested until 2021. You can go to the next slide. So we mentioned she's a revolutionary in thinking about women's prison movement. She is an educational leader. She's a community builder. She was released in 2021, but in 2023, in this current genocide against Gazans, she published, rightfully so, a work on violation against women and men during the current genocide in Gaza. So this is current times. She was re-prisoned, re-arrested by the Zionist entity because she's a truth teller. And this is what both states do in the US or in Israel. They are following each other's examples. And it's really, she is an idol for many people. And we have to understand that it's equal parts, women and men and children are all detained primarily in the West Bank. So if you get arrested in Gaza, you go to the West Bank. So she's really one of the first ones to produce all of this knowledge. And we'll come back to her when we talk about Palestinian prison organizers. Go to the next one. Walid Dakal. So he is also he was one of the original PLO leaders after the passing of Yasser Arafat. He was involved in one encounter with a few of the PLO resistance fighters and one Israeli soldier got killed. That was the reason he was sentenced for 37 years in prison. And there wasn't substantial evidence for him being the person that the Israeli soldier died. It was the three of them that were implicated and caught in the act of resistance. That was substantial enough to, I guess, from the Zionist entity's perspective, to imprison him. But he is a prime example of resilience in these harsh prison conditions. He's been in prison since 1986. And since then, he's written multiple novels, poems, essays. And so this is an example of academic excellence that the institution in the West reveres, but it's coming out of the most oppressive conditions that Zionist, imperialist, American entities, they're withholding. He was supposed to get released in 2021, but he was charged with smuggling mobile phones and earlier sperm so that his wife and him could conceive children. So those are the reasons his sentence was extended. While he was also in prison, starting in 2015, he, on his own accord, again, by coordinating resources through whatever little commissary permissions that are allowed, he completed his own academic work in 2 bachelor degrees and a master's degree. So he's also, his mind has always been engaged. That's been of value for him since he was imprisoned. And unfortunately, he's an example of, and there's multiple examples of this, people with serious medical conditions that they acquire during the prison sentence, and they're not receiving the care that they deserve. So for him, and this is a theme that's going to come back. So for him specifically, currently he has advanced stage COPD. You can't breathe that oxygen. He also has advanced stage myelofibrosis. And there was one instance of him who was severely ill. He was transferred to an Israeli hospital, and within 3 days, he was transferred back to the prison clinic in the West Bank in Jerusalem, and clearly is not getting the care that he needs. So and this is not a theme that just applies to Palestinian prisoners. This also applies to prisoners in the US. And this is clearly against international law as the West tries to uphold it. It's also against the 1993 Oslo Accords. These prisoners, these leaders are entitled to medical care that they are not getting. And multiple party leaders in Israel have said they would wish to see Abu Walid Akkad die in prison. And so one of our tasks in this movement is to make sure that doesn't happen. Next slide. So yes, exactly what someone in the chat said, multiple instances of medical neglect. So finally, Yazin taught us about the Holy Land Foundation 5. It is composed of Mohammed El Masen, Gaman Alishi, Shukri Abu Bakr, Abdul Rahman Odeh, and Mufid Abdel Kader. And so their pictures are there, and their titles are listed underneath that. But this is the largest, up until 2001, the largest Muslim-based charity organization, predominantly for Muslims. And they had widespread support, but in the wake of 9/11, the West and its leaders decided that we are going to target any and everything that Islam represents, whether it's political or community-based or anything. And so one of the main aims of this charity organization was to provide aid to Gazans specifically, because they, at this point, have been under siege for 5 or 6 years. And that really was the reason they dismantled it. So in 2001, they disbanded this charity. It wasn't until 2008 that the federal court kept trying to find anything that they could use to charge and indict these people. And there was this anonymous star witness that later was revealed to be a Zionist, that said that these people are conspiring to provide funds to Gazan resistance. And the whole case for them that actually led them to get indicted in 2008 was that these funds would lead to an increase in suicide bombers and really resistance fighters in Gaza, and there was no evidence of that at all. There was no evidence of ill ill-intentioned financial transactions. But they have been in jail since 2008, and the largest sentence is 65 years.
So, Assalamualaikum everyone, it's a hate projecting. So I'm going to talk a bit about the health status of political business, or I guess more accurately, the ill health of political business, which is intentional. And as we know a little bit about incarceration in the US, I'm going to spend the next few slides talking a little bit about incarceration of Palestinians, particularly in Palestine. Thank you. So when we, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the African National Congress, and more importantly, the Palestinian people say that, Israel is an apartheid regime, they're obviously referring to a plethora of things. One of these things they're referring to is the carceral system, right? So much like how racist systems in this country, including the carceral system, is very intentionally designed to arrest, detain, imprison, murder a Black American family. Very similarly, these carceral systems abroad have very similar racist roots, and at the same time disadvantage our Palestinian families so that these political prisoners are there excessively by design. So, for example, in occupied Palestine, if you're a Palestinian, you're subject to Israeli military law. Legal orders are enforced by military police and military courts. However, if you're a white Ashkenazi Jewish settler from Brooklyn, from the Upper East Side, from London, who decides to move to occupied Palestine this morning, you are subject to civil law. You are processed in civil courts. And this is very, very relevant, essentially because you are granted more rights, you are granted more protections, and these are people who are obviously not indigenous to that land as well. Hence why we Palestinians for decades, and now Western human rights organizations are calling Israel an apartheid regime. So the carceral system is just one example of that. Under Israeli military law, for example, if you gather 10 people or more without a permit for political reasons, and that means even wearing the keffiyeh or having a Palestinian flag, you could be arrested for more than 10 years. Again, under Israeli military law, if you, according to them, are publicly trying to influence opinion in a way that harms public safety, and I'd say Eric Adams is saying we're doing that right now, you could be arrested again for a 10-year minimum period, right? So that's just one example, or a few examples of the arbitrary charges that are designed so that our Palestinian family are not only arrested, detained, imprisoned, and then die in these systems. So next slide, please. So I work in public health. I deal with data often, and this is a graph that shows Palestinian minors in custody. It's by B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization. And I looked at this graph every few days in October since October 7th, particularly when I was feeling gaslit by the selective outrage against Israeli hostages, right? Because if you just go a few days before October 7th, we had 5,200 Palestinians imprisoned. They were hostages, no. We had 170 children in arbitrary detention. Arbitrary detention means you're detained with no legal process, no trial, no charge, right? So the white Eurocentric world was talking about hostages and how they care for their safety. And at the same time, we will also be gaslit seeing a Palestinian family, how this happened to them for decades. Next slide, please. And as I alluded to before, everything that our Palestinian family has been telling us about all of the violence that they've been experiencing in the carceral system. Right now, we have Western organizations, Israeli, Palestinian human rights organizations, everyone has documented evidence that what they've been saying is true since the beginning of that. Right, so these are 4 published reports that are available online. You can Google them, you can download the PDF, you can disseminate them yourself. And I'll give you the example of Defense for Children International in Palestine. They published this report in March 2023. They tell us that over 60% of minors were arrested overnight. And that's an intentional military torture tactic, rendering our Palestinian family not only without defense, but without rest, right? They documented physical and sexual abuse. Palestinian women were not getting sanitary pads, no basic medical aid, as we know. Also, solitary confinement, which is so commonly practiced in this country as well, has no evidence from a healthcare perspective. And Mondo Weiss actually circulated 2 reports on Tuesday that just replicated all of these findings: sexual abuse, physical abuse. And those were specifically, that report was looking at Palestinian prisoners since October 7th. Next slide, please. So this is just a pictorial representation of the reports that you'll find if you Google and download the PDFs. You know, I think sometimes, especially in our workplaces, things like this, where have more legitimacy socially, unfortunately, than the birth about Palestinian family and their lived experiences. So I would recommend having them skim through and just sharing as well. Next slide, please. So for the next 2 slides, I'm going to share the stories of Ahmed Manasra and Khalif Browder. I want you to reflect on the unnerving parallels between their stories, despite these being children who are imprisoned in different parts of the world, right? So many of you would have seen the video that went viral in 2015, where Ahmed, a 13-year-old child at that point, was run over by an IOF security vehicle. He was left bleeding on the ground, and he did not have access to any emergency medical aid. As he lay crying and bleeding on the ground, if you look at this video that's still available online, you see a settler bending over, screaming at him in Hebrew with the equivalent of "die, you son of a," right? This is an adult man above a 13-year-old's body, and he's profusely bleeding out. So this incident occurred moments before the IOF shot and killed Ahmed's 15-year-old cousin. Allegedly, his cousin ran towards the IOF with a knife. And throughout this whole incident, Ahmed sustained skull fractures. You know how hard it is to crack a skull? And at the age of 13, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. So basically his whole life. Many of you would have also seen Ahmed's interrogation video. It's again available online. It reminds me a lot of the footage that we've seen of Black children in New York, for example, who came to be known as Exonerated 5, right? In all these videos, we see our children in the middle of the night with no counsel, with no guardians, you know, illegally interrogated, and quote us, going against every legal framework known to man, but it happens and it happens to our children. So whilst in prison, Ahmed, he was obviously convicted. 99% of things that go through the military court go to conviction. He was subject to physical and psychological abuse, including a total of 2 years in solitary confinement. So under international frameworks, 15 days or more is considered torture. He went through 2 years. They finally got an MSF psychiatrist to see him. I believe this is 2018, but I may be wrong about the exact date. Because as you know, their medical, coverage is non-existent. They're in detention, and they said that this likely, or this trauma, contributed to his new diagnoses of schizophrenia, new diagnoses of depression, and also as of November 2023, Ahmed's reported suicidal ideation. Ahmed is still imprisoned in central Israel right now, where people with schizophrenia here are not getting their medication. You're not getting in a central Israeli detention centers of Palestinian. Next slide, please. I want to also share the story of Khalif Browder, an African-American child from the Bronx, who at age 16 was alleged to have stolen a backpack with minimal evidence, as you all know, and was ultimately held at Rikers. So again, the parallels with Ahmed. While in prison, Khalif also was violently abused by guards, right? Much like Ahmed, he spent 800 days of solitary confinement. Much like Ahmed, the circumstances led him to develop depression, suicidal ideation. Between the ages of 17 and 19, was 4 in prison. He attempted suicide 4 times. This is still a child, right? In spring 2013, now 20, Khalif was released from prison. Soon after, he got his GED. He enrolled in Bronx Community College. He enrolled in a community program with CUNY. He maintained a GPA of 3.6. He wrote school reports on solitary confinement and mental health. Again, a school report that no 20-year-old should be writing from a position of lived experience. Despite his success on the outside, unfortunately, He completed suicide at the age of 22 at his mother's home. And reflecting on the stories of Ahmed and Khalif, as we just see how our Black Palestinian and Black Palestinian children are stripped of their childlike innocence, and more broadly of the societal protections that are otherwise, offered to children worldwide. Their physical bodies and their minds are being destroyed by a system that I think it's important to note was intentionally designed to destroy every bit of the earth. Next slide, please. So healthcare workers were also concerned for our healthcare worker comrades like Ahmed and Khalid have been targeted, imprisoned, and killed. In Gaza, at least 627 healthcare workers have been martyred and massacred since October. And it's also, this is a really important point, especially from a public health perspective. It's important to note that the people whose job it is to count the deaths and count people in prison are also dead, right? Staff, epidemiologists at the Ministry of Health in Gaza, the majority of them, a large portion of them at least, are dead. So these numbers are lagging, they're underestimated. We ultimately probably won't know how many, but these numbers of 630,000 deaths, it's nowhere near that amount. And also I want to leave you with one last point before I pass it back on to Karan. And conceptually, I think it's important for us to note that when a regime targets healthcare, their intention is to decimate any system that is maintaining life, right? That is necessary for life. So healthcare workers have been historically targeted for their support of literally maintaining life amidst liberation struggles in Palestine, in the US, and in other countries too. And on that note, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague.
Thank you, Harun. This next slide briefly is going to showcase what Harun was mentioning, that the state targets actually people who are directly community building and healing the community, right? We see this right now in the ongoing genocide in Nasser Hospital, in prior in Al-Shifa at the end of November. The directors of the hospital, the chiefs of the departments, they were detained, they are being imprisoned. And it's this idea, it's a profound neurosis, because in the West, we're taught that medicine and healing, it's like this one paradigm, but then the state, if they're not politically aligned with what the state's agenda is, we can very quickly shift the dime and say, well, we're gonna imprison you, because they can, right? When it comes down to control and imperial power and colonialism, the ones that have the armed forces, that have the majority, they can do whatever they want. And that's exactly what we're fighting against. And so that trope that's happening in Palestine right now, specifically in North and the Central Gaza, this has happened historically in the States, specifically with the Black Panther Party, which officially was formed in 1966. And we all hear about how they formed militias and they had gangs that, that shot white people and disturbed the peace. But that was only their armed resistance was to protect their community first and foremost. That lens is completely missing. And a majority of their work was actually focused on health justice. So I'm showing here on your left, the Franklin Lynch People's Free Health Center, which started there, was a link of 13 free health clinics that were specifically all in the South, ranging, first one was in Oakland, California, the last one was in Southern Miami. And it was like this trail of free clinics that the Black Panther Party started. They are not given credit for that in current, historical record. On your right, it's the first sickle cell screening program. Sickle cell disease, it's linked to hemoglobinopathy, knowing like the mechanism of how it happens, was discovered in 1911. But it wasn't until 1971 that the first screening program for sickle cell disease was formulated, and that was done by the Black Panther Party. So this question of Western medicine at the advent of modern medicine, because this predominantly affected peoples of African descent and in the States, Black people, it wasn't worthy of investigating. But actually our current day birth screening goes back to this. And it's something I've never learned in medical school. And it's something I never learned in my biochem courses on molecular mechanisms of disease, where sickle cell disease was the central focus. It came from the Black Panther Party and their leaders that were so advent on understanding that poverty exists, racism exists, it all happens, health injustice is one arm of all of that. Now, in the center, we have Dr. Mutulu Shakur. And he was affiliated with the Black Panther Party, but he was much more involved in the Bronx with the Young Lords. And he's a remarkable human being. He was in prison for 37 years, in prison, again, developed chronic myelogenous leukemia, which is one step higher than myelofibrosis, which is what Abu Walid Dakar had developed. And he specifically, before he was imprisoned, organized a takeover of Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, which was the only hospital pre-segregation, even in the North, that cared for Black people. And it was not resourced, it was run down, but that hospital was still formed. It was really important. And they took it over because there was just weren't enough funds or resources of the initiated opioid epidemic. And what the Young Lords, and in agreement with what the Black Panther Party thought, is that if we can't heal our community, we cannot fight for freedom. So this is an example of resistance, an example of the state labeling someone and their comrades as someone who is a terrorist, a domestic terrorist, but their intentions were to heal people. Their intentions were to fix the problem at its root. And these are the kind of people that they are imprisoning. They're imprisoning people who are trying to change the world for the better. And he was in prison for 37 years. He was released 7 months before he died, because he was in end stage CML and had to go to hospice, and then he died. But even that is like something that the state doesn't do. So it's just an injustice all on its own. Yes.
Great. I am Shay. I'm gonna try to project, and I'm gonna be talking a bit about prison organizing. This is not a call for prison reform. We are asking you all to consider the prison system as a site of struggle and to unveil its true function, which is social control, to contain and neutralize radical thought and disrupt and derail social justice movements. Here we have outlined the 10 demands from the 2018 prison strike. And while these are important and worthy of fighting for, I want to focus more on the manner in which these demands emerge. Prisoners organizing themselves, confronting an unjust system which removes agency and autonomy. They are speaking for themselves. I also want to keep in mind the global context. The current lineage of rebellions initiated by the Attica Revolt was occurring around the same time as anti-colonial struggles and revolutions all around the world. And there's a reason for that, which is that many of the prisoners were exposed to radical ideologies, and that influenced how they organize and view the system itself. In the current liberal environment, you are not going to see these demands in the media. Prison authorities often obfuscate what is happening and deny anything unusual happening in the prisons. This is a narrative, this is part of narrative building and reinforces the impenetrability aspect of prisons. Finally, I want to honor and uplift current demands for Palestinian liberation, specifically demand to free all political prisoners, which I think is not being stressed enough in the media and obfuscates how carcerality is central to the Israeli occupation and its function within settler colonialism. The 2018 prison strike was influenced and commemorated about, I think, the 47th annual Attica Revolt. In his book, Orsami, I always mess up his name, Burton, says, the Long Attica Revolt. He refers to Attica as the Long Attica Revolt. It lays out that incarceration is an act of war. In this way, the state response to Attica is not prevention, but a prolonged and protracted war against Black, Indigenous, and colonized people. Attica is a blueprint for current prison organizing. A lot of people think that prisoners don't have the capacity to lead or the ability to organize. Attica Rebellion is proof that that is a fallacy. Even now we see restrictions, the threat of retaliation and isolation. They still overcome these barriers. The 2018 prison strike was organized by Jailhouse Lawyers Speak and the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, and other prisoner-led organizations. Jailhouse Lawyers Speak is a national collective of incarcerated people providing legal assistance and support for prisoners. IWOC is a prisoner-led section of the industrial workers of the world. Prison conditions are the main determinant of the quality of life for incarcerated prisoners in the United States. especially among the aging population of prisoners, which is growing. Demands to improve conditions can be the most basic thing, like water. But prisons in the US are underfunded, short-staffed, overcrowded. Some tactics by political prisoners, by organizing prisoners, are hunger strikes, which has been undertaken by Palestinian political prisoners, work stoppages, sit-ins, litigation, commissary boycotts. Labor strikes are the most repressed. And that is because they are destructive to the very function of the prison. A lot of the prisoners working in the prison, they do labor for corporations, but the majority is to keep the lights going on. So labor strikes, if that happens, they get repressed very easily and locked down. Those who speak out and organize face severe repercussions and retaliation. Program cuts, recreational cuts, communication and visitation cuts, beatings, solitary confinement, medical neglect. Nevertheless, prisoners continue organizing against repression, finding opportunities for resistance and rebellion. Inside-outside coordination and solidarity is effective to combat repression, such as media statements, campaigns, material support, and create leverage for the political prisoners and other organizing prisoners. While not all the demands were met in 2018, they were able to acquire some material changes. Some states got voting rights, some states had those facilities create oversight boards to determine that the conditions in the prisons were up to standard. The Free Alabama movement is under IWAC. It's a socialist organization of incarcerated people in Alabama and spearheads most of the organizing within the Alabama prisons. They're currently striking right now since February 6th. They're working towards a statewide shutdown. Free Alabama announced their campaign just days after Kenny Smith was the first person executed with nitrogen gas. I don't know if any of you heard about that. Some people that witnessed it said it was absolutely horrible. Free Alabama intends to organize a 90-day prison shutdown against forced labor, and their demands are repealing the Habitual Felony Offender Act, abolishing life sentences without parole, instating mandatory parole guidelines, retroactive sentencing guidelines, and ending nitrogen gas executions. In conclusion, downplaying these examples of self-governance leave the anti-mass incarceration movement in the hands of liberal reformists rather than those most impacted. We should be critical of organizations who don't have incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people at the helm. Nonprofits. I'm just gonna say that very, prisoner organizing efforts speak to prisoner self-governance. It provides a method not only for winning opportunities involved with wages and improvement of conditions, but utilizing a kind of contract bargaining process as a way to leverage some degree of power over how the prison itself is run. Thank you.
And really quickly, in the interest of time, because these themes are often repeating, but going back to one of our elders, Khalida Jarrah, when she was in prison, and she was in prison for more than 2 decades, she's a key revolutionary, specifically about women's existence in Zionist Israeli prisons, and it's very much in parallel with women's existence in US prisons. Almost like the Israeli Zionist forces learned from their big brother, the US. And the thing that I want to point out is because she did remarkable work, hunger strikes, labor strikes, exactly that was a tactic that prison organizers in Palestine learned from our an act of solidarity that they learned from us, we learned from them. But specifically, Ahed Tamimi, who first faced incarceration by Israeli targeting when she was 16, and now she's 23, and most recently just released from 2 months of horrible, torturous experiences. She also wrote a book that was recently published, but she collaborated with Khalida Jarrah that was a big body of work that contributed to her 2023 book about the conditions that women and men face in Israeli prisons, which led to her rearrest. So that just goes to show how Khalida Jarrah and others like her, they're very much concerned with the next generation because they know that their struggle isn't going to end with them. And this is the theme that we see in Black liberation in the West as well, is that our elders understand that it's not going to end with them. There's a next generation to mentor and learn from. And while it's poignant and filled with sorrow to accept that reality, but then it's, we see this profound demonstration of mentorship and intergenerational fight against occupation, imperialism, colonialism that provides a lot of hope. And I think that link between, and especially them both being women, I think that is incredible.
And also to add to this, like the educational programs that
Mhm.
colleges are established in these Zionist
Mhm.
prisons, it kind of takes back the autonomy for people who are incarcerated to make the prison a site, instead of a site of just like repression, a site of learning, political education. And as you know, that like Ahed Tamimi in her autobiography talks about how the humanitarian law class that she attended
Yes.
with television work while she was incarcerated actually changed the trajectory of her life. Like she,
Yes.
through taking that class, learned so much about how the legal system in the Zionist entity oppresses her people, and use that information to kind of go on to want to pursue a career in law. So it's just like really amazing the way that incarcerated folks have been able to take back their autonomy.
Oh, thank you.
And this is an amazing quote that we can read off, or people can kind of read to themselves.
No, I don't mind reading it. So it begins, in the end, we did more than fashion hope out of despair. We also evolved in our narrative, in the way we perceive ourselves, the prison and the prison guards. We defeated any lingering sense of inferiority and turned the walls of prison into an opportunity. When I saw the beautiful smiles on the faces of my students who completed their high school education in prison, I felt that my mission has been accomplished. Hope in prison is like a flower that grows out of a stone. For us Palestinians, education is our greatest weapon. With it, we will always be victorious. And this pays homage to the literacy rate in Gaza, in Palestine, more than 96%, more than any other nation in the world.
I actually wanted to make one point, this is reminding me of this anecdote I shared in one of our Zoom meetings, specifically when we're talking about education with prison system as a means of resistance to building. So I worked with a psychiatry team at Rikers in New York over the summer, and we were rounding, and there was an African-American gentleman who was reading Quran, and one of the attendings was surprised that he was doing that. And I was like, okay, she's a white woman, so I was like, based on the demographics of this prison, and given that, like, 1 in 4 Muslims in this country are African American, I basic math. But then she was actually like, no, there's been a recent crackdown in book giving when it comes to people in prison, right? She was like, he shouldn't have been able to get the Quran, actually. Apparently there was some case many moons ago where someone that used to look as a rabbi, and then there's now claims that people can, put drugs in the books, and all of these things that we've historically said to criminalize racialized folk here and everywhere else. And it just made me think of them, they would still do their Friday prayers on the Friday, they'd get together in groups, they would learn, even outside of, even among like secular communities. When I was rounding, they were often kids, when I say kids, between like 18 to 20, with books right next to their beds, as we found on them, because this is kids, right, in youth detention. And then I remember before I left, well, actually, no, my first day, and then before I left, one of them was like, Dr. Khan, would you do me a favor? I only met him 20 minutes ago, I wasn't sure. So can you just give me chapter 2 of this book? This crossword puzzle, can you photocopy it? Because we're not allowed to have more than 20 pages at a time. And he'd obviously been asking people months prior, he had no collection. Obviously my heart freaking melted. I was like, I'm gonna do this job. So we sorted that out for him, but it just reminded me that these are some of the most talented minds in this country and elsewhere. And they really truly use education as resistance. And inshallah we can uplift that. So some of us may probably even do a book drive for writers this summer, and stay tuned with our groups in the club.
So we want to bring on via Zoom one of our speakers, Bree from Oaxaca, Pan African Community Action. Yeah.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bree coming from DC, Pan-African Community Action, and the DC chapter of Black Lions for Peace. So I'm going to talk a little bit about George Jackson. As we're talking about political prisoners, I think there are very few people that kind of embody this the way that George Jackson has in writing. So for those that don't know, I know we did a little bit of overview earlier. George Jackson was sentenced to 1 year to life for stealing $70 from a gas station in 1961. He spent a lot of his years in prison in solitary confinement. And George Jackson, above all, he's a theorist, he's an intellectual, he's a brother, he's a political prisoner, he's an organizer, and he understood his condition. And honestly, the crux of political prisoner as an entity is a being that understands themselves and their condition and the world around them so deeply that it just scares the oppressor, terrifies the oppressor. But George Jackson didn't only conceive of himself as a political prisoner. He conceived of an entire mass of people as political prisoners. So I'm going to read a little bit from Soledad Brothers, political prisoners, from George Jackson himself. He said, in the last 10 years have brought an increase in the percentage of Blacks for crimes that can clearly be traced to political economic causes. There are still some Blacks here who consider themselves criminals, but not many. Believe me, my friend, with the time and incentive that these brothers have to read, study, and think, you will find no class or category more aware, more embittered, desperate, or dedicated to the ultimate remedy revolution. The most dedicated, the best of our kind, you'll find them in the Folsoms, San Quintins, and Soledads. They live like there was no tomorrow, and for most of them, there wasn't. So his ideas and his concept of political prisoners extended beyond himself. And truly within George Jackson's intellectual work, we can see a lot of that expansion, whereas he was always thinking of connections. He was always thinking larger than himself and larger than the one prison he was in and larger than the United States of America. He was thinking globally. He was thinking of a global colonial people. And George Jackson talked a lot about domestic colonialism and Black people as a domestic colony in the United States and the surveillance, the harassment, the containment within the ghettos, the lack of resources, the intense surveillance. I was on the metro the other day, and now the metro security, now they walk in and they walk down the trains instead of just patrolling the platforms. Now they walk up and down the trains with clipboards and a gun on their hip. And for what? So he understood that the idea of the colony is something that is a very powerful political tool, and that people that are theorists and are thinking of these things through can use that in order to understand their conditions, in order to understand revolution. George Jackson wrote a lot about revolution and what's necessary for colonial people to resist. He wrote a lot about resistance and violence and what it means to be a colonial people and what it means to band together with other colonial people in order to take down a common enemy. So today, one of the main things, it would be very difficult. It's very difficult to try to kind of contain a lot of George Jackson's theories about internationalism to the lot of time that we have. But I do encourage everybody to read Soledad Brothers and Blood in My Eye. I also encourage everyone to put in the chat your comments. My comrades in DC know I'm very big on chat participation. So feel free to throw in the chat if you have any comments, questions, etc. But getting back to George Jackson internationalism. While incarcerated, George Jackson read Mao, read Lenin, read Fanon. He was very, very inspired by colonial movements across the world. And he used the colonial movements across the world. And at that time, the United States was deep in the thick of the Vietnam War. So he was using what he was seeing in Vietnam and the analysis he was seeing from thinkers across the globe in order to contextualize coloniality and resistance. So I think that's really important to note, because being a colonial person in the imperial core with an analysis of that extends beyond yourself and extends across oceans and across continents is really important for his theories of resistance. And it's really important in how he theorized resistance and how he theorized the end of colonialism and imperialism and the common enemy of capital and profit. So while he was incarcerated, George Jackson was learning languages. He was trying to learn Arabic, Spanish. He was trying to learn Swahili because he said that if he could learn these languages, he could communicate with colonial people across the world. He wanted to communicate with the masses of people. So the really important part about George Jackson's theories is that the idea of solidarity as not being some kind of a charity, some kind of a sympathy, some kind of a handout, but being a necessary component of resistance and a necessary component to colonial people's resistance against the oppressor. So the function of solidarity wasn't a kind of transactional, I'm helping you because you're helping me. It was an understanding that there is no freedom for anybody if we don't band together. And it was an understanding that whatever differences we have as people, understanding and acknowledging our common enemy and banding together to fight that common enemy trumps all, you know, small petty grievances that we might have with one another. He was very big on fostering that kind of internationalism. And I'm going to go into another little part from Soledad Brothers, where he writes specifically about internationalism and the importance of internationalism. And he says so much in this. It's just like a very small part. The capitalist Eden fits my description of hell. To destroy it will require cooperation and communion between our related parts, communion between colony and colony, nation and nation. The common bond will be the desire to humble the oppressor, the need to destroy capitalist man and his terrible, ugly machine. If there were any differences or grievances between us in the Black colonies and the people of other colonies across the country, around the world, we should be willing to forget them in the desperate need for coordination against American fascism. So a lot of George Jackson's work, yes, settle your quarrels. That was one of his most famous quotes, was about settle your quarrels and coming together. And he was very serious about that because he understood the dire need for it. It's a literal matter of life and death. So when we talk about the solidarity between Black and Palestinian political prisoners and Black and Palestinian colonial people and the Black and Palestinian struggle together, we understand it as a struggle between colonial people that know that they're stronger together than they ever could be separately, and understand that it is a specific, it's a specific tactic of the oppressor to sow division between us and to make it seem as though our fights are separate when they're not. And we have to fight with our entire being against that instinct because it doesn't serve any of us to delve into separatism. It doesn't serve any of us to do that because we know that as colonial people, we are fighting imperialism, we are fighting neocolonialism, we're fighting it in Haiti, we're fighting it on the continent, we're fighting it in the Congo, we're fighting it in Palestine, we're fighting it here. So we know that if we're fighting all these things together, and we know that our common enemy is profiting off of our division, our labor, our resources, the pillaging of our lands, and is making us hate each other, that only serves to protect them and their interests. We have no interest in protecting them. We have no duty to unite with fascism. We have no duty to unite with colonial powers against other colonial people. That would not serve us. George Jackson understood that it is imperative for us to be in solidarity with each other always, that none of us are free until all of us are free. And that when we are going into this fight together, hand in hand, we understand that it's not a kumbaya measure of friendship. It's not a personal liking. You don't have to personally like everyone you're in solidarity with. It is knowing that it is necessary for our survival to band together as colonial people. And that when we're seeing each other face to face and we see our struggles within each other, that is how we get the necessary strength to fight our oppressors. That's how we take them down, because we are the masses of people. There isn't another there isn't a Messiah that's going to come and save the masses of people. We are the masses, and the power within the masses is in their unity. So George Jackson understood that when we're seeing all these horrible, horrible massacres, the horrible genocide of the Palestinian people, we're seeing them and we're seeing ourselves clearer than we could ever see anything else. The people of Palestine have such an ideological clarity about their enemy, and that is the ideological clarity that George Jackson had until his very last breath. He knew with very extreme clarity that the world is sick, that a world that criminalizes and colonizes and pillages people is a sick world, and that there is no sense or duty to be sane in a world that is sick. And a world that is sick can only be rooted out by the power of the colonial peoples banding together. So this quote that's on the screen right now is actually from Blood in My Eye. And it says that the ugly side of imperialism is being demonstrated not just for the people that suffer its effects abroad, but for the little sleepy guy here in the US. They're starting now to make the link between foreign wars and foreign businesses. George Jackson understood that understanding the link between business and money and governments will help you understand imperialism, and it'll help you understand colonialism, and it'll help you understand the interests of the people that are profiting off of the colonial subject. So that's a little bit about George Jackson. I don't want to take up too much time because I don't want to run over my allotted time. And there's this last quote that I'll end on, which is that we must establish true internationalism with other anti-colonial peoples. Then we will be on the road of the true revolutionary. Only then can we expect to seize the power that is rightfully ours, the power to control the circumstances of our day-to-day lives. Pan-African Community Action has tools of analysis, and one of them being that Black people are a domestic colony. Another one being that the issue is power, not racism. So George Jackson here is elaborating on the fact that power, the power to control your circumstances, the self-determination to take your own resources and live and die and work or not work and still be able to pay your bills and feed your family and get treatment for your illnesses and your ailments is a matter of life and death for colonial people. And until we have that power, until we have that self-determination, and that is when we will know that the revolutionaries succeeded. That's where freedom lies, and the power to control your own circumstances without being at the whims of colonial powers and the oppressor. So I'll leave you all on that. Thank you for my comrades in New York for inviting me here today, for everybody online that's listening.
Thank you, Bree.
All right. So we want to shift over to sort of a question and answers, and I think we're going to do it, also hybrid with folks in person. Well, actually, I'm sorry. First, we're going to go through this call.
No, but that's good housekeeping, so you guys know, like a little plan of action. We create a link tree as a resource for solidarity for political prisoners and incarcerated people. It's by no means extensive, but is a good primer for inside-outside solidarity. We chose to highlight current campaigns that are urgent. Obviously Mumia, Leonard Peltier's is on there, and also the Huru movement, Hands Off Peru is on there. Solidarity relieves the burden on political prisoners facing repression. If incarcerated people do want to organize, having a connection to the outside is critical to their success. Right now, building up these existing structured and broad coalitions of prisoner support is crucial to movement building. Political prisoners are not an isolated piece of the uprisings that occurred in this country. Neither is it to the Palestinian liberation movement. Political prisoners are central to movement development and movement building. It would be a dishonor to their sacrifice and a dishonor to our movements if we abandon them. They're the guiding rails to our struggles for liberation. We have to be explicit and resolute about the demand to free all political prisoners and what that would mean for our generation moving forward. Every day, the carceral state targets people who have made our social movements possible. They have fought for our liberation. Now it's time for us to fight for theirs and bring them home. Incarcerated voices should be heard at the leadership level and on equal footing with outside organizations. Speaking of, on that link tree, you'll see Jailhouse Slurs Speak, you see IWalk, you see Free Alabama Movement. Incarcerated and informally incarcerated led activism stresses internationalism, which helps make connections such as solidarity with the Palestinian Liberation Movement. Historically, as we've seen, Black revolutionary elders have stressed internationalism as well to confront the imperialist system we have. The primary contradiction. It's important to make human connections and support the organizations listed on the link tree and help deepen your understanding of the carceral state, how it functions on an environmental level, on a social level, on economic consequences of its existence. Prisoner solidarity is an act of defiance against the carceral state and its attempt to dehumanize and abandon people. There's an increase in support and care work recently. If you know, through COVID, there have been campaigns to bail people out. I remember specifically seeing that a lot. So it'd be easy to really plug into anything in any of the organizations listed. The Jericho movement is really great. It's an organization devoted to advocating for political prisoners and their release. The Linktree has zines about how to write political prisoners and become a pen pal. Being a pen pal is a great way to show solidarity and make a difference in someone's life. When they announce mail in prison, everyone can hear it. So that offers them a sense of protection in a way, and it also makes them feel like they're not disappeared, especially if they're queer or trans. So that's in there. We included a website for Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, as I said, IWAC, the Free Alabama Movement, and other organizations that are incarcerated and prisoner-led. Follow their pages, their Instagram for updates, read their newsletters, their blogs, consider joining local chapters. Jericho Movement has a local chapter here. Prisoner organizing should start from the bottom up, from the inside of the walls to outside. Many political prisoners have websites. Somebody shared Josh Williams' website earlier. Leonard Peltier has a website. Keith Richards, I believe, also has a website. They have websites. Sign up for their mailing list. They often contain legal updates, calls to action against repression for their activism, or they just have blog posts writing about their political beliefs, their ideology, or what life is like within prison. Support political prisoners' voices in writing. As I said, you should be skeptical of any organization that does not have prisoners or formerly incarcerated people at the helm. In the link tree, I had a link to Prison Journalism Project, Scallywag Magazine, and PEN America also have initiatives to help center writing written by prisoners themselves. Other acts of solidarity include donating books and money. My comrade here mentioned how books are kind of being restricted, especially in New York State right now. Linktree has Books Behind Bars. That's also a local organization in New York that sends books to incarcerated people. I think it's all across the state. The most requested books is dictionaries, which is crazy. But you know, they want dictionaries. The next one is a Quran. The next one I think is I want to say the Atlas. So you know, that's super important. Maybe you can send them money. Many current and former political prisoners have ongoing legal battles and medical issues. We mentioned Sekou Odinga. There was a fund for him when he came home, which was really amazing. And it reached its goal, but unfortunately he passed on anyway. There's also banner drops, phone zaps, supporting striking prisoners. The Free Alabama Movement is having a vigil and protest outside the St. Clair prison. The day of the action, just flood their phones with phone calls supporting them. Noise demos, vigils outside prisons. There's also petition and letter writing for parole release. A lot of times prisoners will seek kind of good standing when they go on parole. And if you send a letter to their parole, even if you don't know that person, it's very good to like talk about them and like the fact that they did their time and now it's time for them to come home. They're not a threat to society anymore. Most of our elders are old people. Like they're on the brink of death before they're released. You can also form study groups or book club, highlighting issues on the local level to educate people and to take action. Finally, on the back table, we have the Certain Days calendar. Each month has essays, beautiful artwork by political prisoners. It also has important dates for revolutionary action. It brings me so much joy. Like I love it every day and I love flipping it every month. So yeah, I look to it again, please inspired. Please do that. And the most important thing is that its composition is based on anti-imperialism, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, feminist, queer, trans liberation, and all proceeds from the calendar go to grassroots organizations. Every single year, they pick a different group of people, and also the Political Prisoners Fund as well. So, thank you.
So I think we're gonna take some questions on Zoom or in person. You guys can throw questions in the chat, or folks here have any questions.
Would love some questions from the chat to engage people who stuck all the way through.
Right.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
Dad.
you. Manny just wants to make a quick point before we get to.
Yeah,
1 second.
Martin, give us a second,
Real
please.
quick, y'all, for everyone in person, there's also, hand cards for you, to have, resources. It's also in the link tree, but if you wanna grab a couple just to give people, both cards have the same thing, they're just different pictures on them. And then in the link tree, the link tree also has the link to, like she said, has everything on there. But in person, if you wanna grab a couple, just to hand out to people, that'd be great.
Awesome.
Literally, if you just wanna just hand them out to people on the street, that also works too. But if you have the place you're going, feel free to grab some.
Martin, you can go ahead.
You good to go now, Martin? Martin?
If Martin isn't there, but there's anyone else that wants to unmute and ask a question or throw a question in the chat.
why?
Do they have a hand up?
No.
Okay, it must be a different item.
No? Okay.
So I see a question from Tara, how to get through the Israeli prisons with similar solidarity actions, is that even possible?
The organization.
Samidun.
There we go. There's an organization called Samidun that actually does work to try to organize for political prisoners in Palestine. I'll drop the information in the chat. And we'll try to, it's in the link tree, it's in the link tree. I haven't looked at it in a little while, but it's in the link tree. So, yeah, Samidun.
Space and Bushwick. They have a teach-in this Friday.
Oh, they have a teach-in this Friday at the Mayday space, which is in Brooklyn, right?
Yeah.
It's in Brooklyn.
Follow their social media, I'm sure there's more information on that, but that's great, thank you.
There was another one. Are there other groups around the state under yours as well? Yeah. Can you elaborate on that one,
Nina?
Nina? Can you just give us, like, reply to it and just give us a little bit more, we'll answer you.
Is that a woman?
Maybe we'll take a question from the room. Anyone have any questions about what they heard today?
Or just general comments?
Yeah.
Actually, I'll add a comment just based on that question. I think when we're talking about especially Palestinian political prisoners, given just erasure, I think this is the opportune moment for us to reassert the situation of Palestinian political prisoners right now, right? Especially with this very whitewash Eurocentric narrative around hostages, right? If you care about hostages, if you care about people in detention, then you should also be caring about the 5,000 Palestinian hostages that existed before October 7th. Be consistent or stay in your lane. So we should be saying this as well. And again, 170 children in arbitrary detention. If you care about legal processes that Americans claim to, then care about all of them, right? So I think that's very much, I know it's a scary time for many of us in the workplace. But if you're not going to speak up now, or at least think about it, I don't think we ever will.
Right. This is the time to be fearless.
Hmm.
If we have the privilege, it's time to be fearless.
So I see Tony asked the question, are there any chapters from the organizations represented on this call in the North Jersey area? So there's Black Alliance for Peace, New York and New Jersey. And then we have Healthcare Workers for Palestine, which I believe there is a New Jersey chapter. We can drop some information in the chat. And then Writers Against the War on Gaza, I'm not sure specifically if they have representation in New Jersey. Maybe if there's anyone on the Zoom that is from that org that can speak to that. But for healthcare workers and for that, for sure, we have New Jersey folks. And if you're interested in getting plugged in, you can send us like a private message on the Zoom.
They weren't featured, unfortunately, we were, we tried to get, they weren't featured, although we did mention it, but Sami Doom does also have New Jersey chapter. So if folks are interested in getting plugged in with them, they have one.
And then Nina, to answer your question about other chapters in other states, Black Lives for Peace has chapters all over the United States. And same thing with Healthcare Workers for Palestine, actually. So if you go to like either of their Instagram pages, if you're on social media, you can probably see if they have a chapter that's in your area. But as I said, I'll share some information in the chat. Anyone? Questions or comments?
Don't be shy, y'all, don't be shy.
Was anything surprising to you that was presented? Because for me, when I was researching some of the parts that I presented, it was brand new information. And it did change the trajectory of like my thought processes. So was anything here that you didn't know about and it kind of is gonna change your perspective on the current moment?
For me, you were going over the incarceration in Palestine slide, all of those facts with even the military force are gonna be pretty much almost 100% conviction rate, and 95% of Palestinians experiencing some form of torture. That to me is extremely shocking. I know that there's like similar tactics in the US used against political prisoners, but definitely not to the egregious extent that was happening in Palestine. So that was something that I don't know how we could fight here, but I would love to, in whatever capacity possible, be able to fight against that, because that's insane.
And this is the most moral, democratic, secular state. The Middle East, right? Like this is the contrast, but I agree. There are some things here that are just shocking to the human psyche, and I think Western ideology, capitalism, they teach us to like preserve the shock, but some of these things are like completely not compatible with each other. They're completely contradictory. If you're the most moral state in the Middle East, no other Arab state has that. This military aggression, this violent prison system that's specifically for one ethnicity and one race.
Yeah.
Right? That does not exist anywhere else in that. So I agree with, thank you for bringing that up, because there are some things here that just don't have to do with data or facts or theory. It's just the fact of this has never existed before, and Israel has created this violence in their state against people who are not Israeli or Jewish. And that is new. That's why it's called neoliberalism. Neo-colonialism, but also neoliberalism. I agree with that point.
And just talking about the better descriptive, but like the pettiness of what Israeli military can be like. So I wasn't surprised by most of it when I was doing the research. Yeah, but the one that really perturbed me only because of the way Europe and the US talk about the Israeli regime right now was when, again, you can be in prison for 10 years or more for influencing public opinion in a way that they perceive public safety is being impaired, right? And there are people, politicians, whomever, in this city right now, who would consider us doing the same thing right now, if I'm talking to you about calls for assistance. So the fact that we were just Palestinian and helping fight Palestine, we could be detained for a minimum of 10 years based on this presentation. Isn't that just insane?
Facebook posts, WhatsApp chats, survey, right? We have this question of surveillance state, like that. The Israeli government is learning that from us, and they use similar technologies. So yeah, that's an exciting thing.
I see a question from Chama about what are some conversational talking points when faced with this take from peers? I was just asking for some clarification, if their meaning in terms of conversational talking points, when faced with, conversation about political prisoners in the US and Palestine.
Just a general point before we get extra clarification. But people, particularly in the last few months, we're talking about Palestine. I think there's a notion of white emboldenment, right? People engage in discussions knowing very little, but they are ready for you to know less than them or just as little. So they be saying the most random ass stuff. And because if you don't know anything, you can't respond. Do you get what I mean? They're like, we all let Gaza. I was like, if you can't get there by land, sea, and air, that's an irrelevant point. Stop talking, right? So we see that you can shut down conversations by basic information. People really don't know anything that's going on right now. So educate yourselves,
Yeah.
shut it down, and yeah, knowledge is power. Yeah. I don't get into these debates. At work, I get into these debates, they shut down very quickly because people don't know anything.
Like they expect you to be as dumb as they are, it's insulting.
Yeah.
All right, I think we will probably close out the Zoom at this point. I don't see any more questions coming through the chat. Danya says shut it down, we agree.
Yes.
Until Palestine is free, until we're all free.
That's
That
right.
is actually the motto for the 2021 prison strikes.
Shut it down, right, period. So thank you guys so much for joining us. This was such a fruitful conversation. We're so happy that you were able to join on Zoom or in person. Follow the link tree for more resources about how to get plugged into solidarity and support for political prisoners. And follow us on Instagram, keep up with the amazing work that Black Lions for Peace, Healthcare Works for Palestine, WAWA, PACA are all doing. And yeah, free Palestine.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
On the link tree, there's a link to the Ahura 3. Can you guys just make sure you take note of that? We're talking about political prisoners, and the FBI right now is trying to create some more. So if you can take a few minutes to kind of scroll through that, just to acclimate yourself to that, and to, if possible, get involved. Yeah, that would be really appreciated.
Join an organization.
And join our organization.
Yeah. Struggle together.
Thank you, y'all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.